what we're seeing at like the consumer selfie drone level is just the tip of the iceberg.
If there was an emergency and you've only been flying autonomously and you have to pick up the controller, use the sticks, are you going to accurately use the sticks, accurately fly the aircraft?
Oh, it's been crashed lots. It's pretty durable. Major Canadian companies doing delivery operations from across the country using 5G. We come back to how are they going to take full autonomous or full manual control in the event that they need to.
Like, let's say it was an autonomous mapping mission. What scenarios would you need a visual observer for that? Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Coastal Drone Weekly Live. My name is Finn. I'm here with Ian and Cam at the board, and today we're talking about autonomous drones and drone autonomy.
Now you got to figure out how to get it back.
Now I got to figure out how to get it back. If I just wave at it, is it going to come back to me?
Nope, put your hand out.
Oh.
Let's see if it'll do it. It might not because you're...
Is it too dark or is it too much clutter?
Well, it's too far away. So if I put my hand out, it should recognize the hand. Nope, it thinks I'm ground. Don't want to. Okay, we'll do the old flip. That totally didn't work the way it should have.
So today we're going to talk about what drone autonomy is. This was an example of drone autonomy, maybe some of its limitations, as we could see, and some of the regulatory implications around drone autonomy. Cam's going to have fun editing that section. Yeah. So what is an autonomous drone? Broadly speaking, an autonomous drone is an RPAS or a UAV that requires no human intervention for its control. They are controlled using software or artificial intelligence to provide their navigation and obstacle avoidance. These devices are ideally suited for long, repetitive missions like scouting emergency and emergency response situations around remote areas, power lines, mapping, railways, right-of-ways, this sort of thing.
Yeah, so repetitive flights, repetitive survey missions, things that require, if once you've done it once and you can repeat it, try and remove the human element from the flight control.
Exactly. So there are different levels of drone autonomy, from a little limited autonomy to full autonomy. According to Cloud Factory, there are 5 levels of autonomy, from no autonomy up to full autonomy. When we're in no autonomy, this is like your RC helicopter.
Level 0.
Yeah, you need to be able to do every command, no obstacle avoidance, no nothing. For low autonomy, the pilot is still in control, but maybe there's some sort of detect and avoid function or obstacle avoidance.
So would stability augmentations be considered part of autonomy, or is that a separate feedback loop? Because we're talking about 2 different things here. Like if you bought an RC helicopter that has no gyro, and it would instantly flip over as soon as you try to take off and let go of the controls, is that autonomy or is that stabilization?
I would consider stabilization not part of autonomy because that's more like a flight controls thing. This is in terms of like obstacle avoidance. So,
okay, so recognition and action.
Exactly. Like the actual like navigation.
Yep.
When we're talking about autonomy, we're really talking about navigation.
Because there's autopilot autonomy.
Autopilot, based on what Cloud Factory say, I would consider autopilot in a manned aircraft like semi-autonomous, because you as the pilot, you set what altitude you want to hold at, and then the aircraft will hold its own altitude, which I guess is similar to what these drones do, but you just do it with a dial as opposed to just like setting it at an altitude and holding it.
So then that's flight control systems.
Potentially like more of a flight control system. The autopilot in an aircraft can't make any decisions.
Yeah, same as flight control. If its job is to hold level, it's not making a decision, it's using some sort of feedback loop. Barometer goes up, barometer goes down, altitude adjusts accordingly.
Okay, let's take that back then.
So it's not autonomous.
So there are, broadly speaking, level 0 to level 5 levels of autonomy. And when we're talking about autonomy, what we mean is that the drone can make decisions for itself in terms of navigation. Flight control is not necessarily autonomy because you as the pilot decide which altitude to hold at. But you as the pilot decide which altitude to hold at, but it's just going to hold that altitude. It's not deciding which altitude to hold at. When we get to higher levels of autonomy, potentially if there's an obstacle, then the drone will make the decision itself and navigate around that obstacle. That is more autonomy. So when
it's taking multiple inputs.
Exactly.
It's not just a setting dial. Now it's setting dial, radar, weather, something else. Right?
Exactly. If it's able to make a decision, then we can consider it some level of autonomy. The flight control on board an aircraft or on board a drone that keeps it level is not necessarily making a decision, maybe slightly to hold a pitch attitude or something like that. But if it's able to make a decision, we call that autonomy. And where autonomy comes in, when we get to the level 5 full autonomy, all you have to do is press go. and it will navigate around obstacles and also fly the mission without pilot input. And in theory, the pilot wouldn't even have to hit go for that to be. It could be programmed by someone, and then no one even is there to tell the mission to start, or maybe it's at a pre-programmed time.
Yeah, time or conditions or some sort of trigger like a security tripwire or something if
Exactly.
it's a surveillance system.
Exactly. So that differs from kind of like autopilot. When we're talking about autopilot, that's maybe like return to home or flying via waypoints, using the quick shot feature on DJI drones, or maybe like a cruise control. These are not necessarily making a decision. You as the pilot in command, you make the decision to return to home. It flies the return to home as you've decided to make it.
Well, this is a good example. So for DJI return to home, you have two major modes of return to home. There's the original return to home, which is a pre-programmed action, and it's regardless of its surroundings, which is where autonomy comes in. The drone would climb up to a preset altitude, return to preset GPS coordinates that are recorded when it fires up, and then it would land automatically. That's not autonomy in the sense that it's not making any decisions. It's just using pre-programmed inputs. With the Mavic 3 onward, they started to get smarter because they now had omnidirectional obstacle avoidance. So now there's a level of autonomy because it's using external inputs to determine its flight path. Instead of going all the way up, across, and then back down again, at the present altitude, the drone would determine on a stringline approach to the coordinates that it needs to go to, are there any obstacles in my way? If not, continue straight. If there are obstacles in my way, navigate around them using my vision system. So autonomy is now part of that process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about the cruise control aspect here, because DJI, like some of the newer ones, have some sort of cruise control. This is one of the features on the DJI aircraft, and you'll see that it's not like is not necessarily making. It's not the same as like full autonomy.
It's supposed to hold a path. Mm-hmm. Like imagine like a cable camera on a film set, right? It only has a linear path. So it will continue along that path while you do other things. So you're handing off one component of the flight control system to an autopilot.
Mm-hmm. Kind of like cruise control in your car. You hit the cruise control button and you take your foot off the gas pedal and it just...
Depending on its level of autonomy,
mm-hmm.
it can do certain things.
Yeah, so I have two vehicles. In one of my vehicles, it has cruise control, but it's an older car, so it doesn't. If I hit the brakes, it's not going to accelerate back when it's clear. But Ian's got a Tesla; it will cruise control and then, in theory, accelerate.
Or try to drive you into a wall,
or or hop the curb,
depending on its mood.
And then there's the DJI also has the quick shot feature, which is also a semi-autonomous.
So that one in the video right now, they're using a Mini 2, and a Mini 2 has no obstacle avoidance at all. So I would, again, argue this isn't really autonomous. It's pre-programmed actions, right? So there's a reference start point. Like imagine this in 3D space. Like I think it's doing the spiral right now. Or it's doing something. I didn't see which one, but they're all pre-programmed 3-dimensional actions. Take X, Y, Z coordinates and time, so the fourth dimension, and then move to these points at a certain point, but you always start from a known reference point.
Right.
Or use a vision tracking system.
But it will hit something.
Oh, yeah, totally. Even the Mavic 3, I've watched like hit trees or whatever. It's there's always an aspect to it. So you can see this one's using a vision tracking system right now to maintain a lock on that architecture. So it's using an input. So there is an increased level of autonomy. This would be more than. Are we going to call each level at this, or are we just going to say this is more or less?
I think more or less.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's like that was what that list of like levels of autonomy. I think that was just one company's version of levels of autonomy. I don't know if there's like a specific.
The reality of it is, like DJI autonomy has gotten incredibly good. We started off by talking about the Neo. The Neo uses some sort of neural processing accelerator on board to use facial recognition in real time to imprint on its operator and ignore other faces around. We'll throw the video in here. I had two of my other pilots on Sky Helicopters stand in front of me, and I dodge back and forth behind them, and the drone followed me, and it anticipated my movement. So there is a full autonomy in that mode. The drone is doing its entire flight on its own at that point.
Mm-hmm. And this is, if you buy it without the controller, this is like $250, right?
Yeah.
So that's a lot of tech in a affordable package.
Yeah, and it's not the first. It's the current best offering.
Mm-hmm. Because as far as I know, like some of the other ones were like maybe the Spark, but that thing had like
It's
very
a long
old.
time ago. So just in current competitors, there's the Hover Air X1 and X1 Pro. Higher price point, bigger drone physically. I don't know if it's under 250 or not. I haven't got the specs in front of me, but a really good, there's a YouTuber out there, DC Rainmaker. He does drone gauntlet testing, and he goes on his bike and he runs through the woods. And the coolest thing about that one is the person following mode that it has is path tracing. It's not, because it doesn't have any obstacle avoidance, it doesn't have any stereo vision or any other advanced processing on board. What it's doing is it's looking at the path that the target took and using some sort of neural processing instead of using stereoscopic vision to figure out that path in 3D space and then approximate it through the woods. So if you go through a narrow wood path, it does a pretty good job of seeming like it can obstacle avoidance when it's actually doing vision from a singular camera.
Hopefully there's just not a tree canopy on top of it, or else it'll plow straight into him. So let's talk about the laws and regulations in Canada around drone autonomy. CARS 901.32, and they're pretty explicit in Canada. No pilot shall operate an autonomous remotely piloted aircraft system or any other remotely piloted aircraft system for which they are unable to take immediate control of the aircraft. So what does that mean? It means that if you plan a mission, a fully autonomous mission, like a mapping mission or something, you need to be sitting there with the controller.
You need a ground control station.
Where if something goes wrong, you have to be able to take control of that aircraft, land that aircraft, or
unless you have an SFOC in place.
Exactly.
And that's kind of the key takeaway with everything. Whenever there's a air regulation that's in place in the 900s, in any air regulation, to get an exemption from that, you need an SFOC or a Special Flight Operations Certificate.
That's right. For operators, if you want to do it in a beyond visual line of sight or an atypical, you would need a Special Flight Operations Certificate. Transport Canada would then approve that specific equipment and specific job for use beyond visual line of sight. For now.
Well, and even still, so when we're talking about autonomy, there's a very good chance that it's not just beyond line of sight. It's in different geographic regions.
Yes.
I've seen videos where people have used IP remote links to run an FPV camera in a building 1,000 miles away. And they've figured out the latency problems and gotten to the point where the latency is so good they could do that. I've seen major Canadian companies doing delivery operations from across the country using 5G. So those are not only beyond line of sight, but we come back to how are they going to take full autonomy or full manual control in the event that they need to.
Would you then need a visual observer if you wanted to do, like, let's say it was an autonomous mapping mission? What scenarios would you need a visual observer for that?
A bunch. So let's take your most typical scenario. Let's say you're doing a beyond line of sight burn pile thermal assessment. So it's a 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer stretch that you're covering and you've been asked to cover. Well, the most practical way to do it would be to do it beyond line of sight or extended visual line of sight. The drone is going to be semi-autonomous because you pre-lay out the mapping mission. It will tell you how much can be done with a battery before it needs to return to land and complete it. So that part is going to be automatically done, and the camera is going to be automatically captured, everything else. Vision system should work depending on the drone for obstacle avoidance. You would then need to deploy a visual observer at multiple points and continue to have full verbal contact with them, either through two-way radio, phone, or some sort of IP voice chat. They just need to be able to communicate with the pilot in command that has the ability to halt the mission immediately and or take manual control of the drone. The other option, depending on the drone, some drones and some controllers have the ability to hand off control to a remote operator. So you can have, you could do a linear path, for example. Let's say you wanted to do a 10 kilometer stretch, but it was only 500 meters wide. You could do that by having multiple visual observers and then multiple controllers along the way, so that if it went out of radio range of the first one, you could then hand off control to the second controller and operator and subsequently the next. You're going to be able to run the controller a lot farther than you can see, so you would need more visual observers than you would need control operators, but that is one way that you could do let's say a pipeline thermal survey, for example.
And then something like this, if you operate this without the controller, as we showed in the intro here, operating without the controller, I would say that I was not able to take direct control of the drone in the event of an emergency. So autonomous micro drones, what's the
I was going to say, what's the get out of jail free?
This is 150-ish grams. 135 grams. So because this is a micro drone, the 901 section of the cars is not applicable to this drone. Therefore, I was like you saw in the intro, I couldn't control this aircraft. Ian had to grab it with his hand and flip it over to get it to stop. So if that was, let's say this was a 251 gram drone and I couldn't do that, that would no longer be.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I don't think you'd be able to sell it without a manual controller in that case.
Exactly, because in theory I should be able to hold up my hand and it comes back to land, but that clearly was not. And this is not the ideal conditions for that.
No,
it was
dark
not. It was, and I've got a mic in front of me.
I couldn't see your face.
But yeah, probably. But this was not reliable enough that I could consider that to not be. That I could not. That.
Okay. If the gestures were fail-safe, would that be sufficient?
Because it just says take manual control.
So if it was purely operated by gestures.
And they were 100% accurate all of the time.
Yeah.
Or at least accurate enough to a relative.
There's got to be some level of reliability that would be required under JARIS, like Joint Association for Remote Unmanned. So.
Yeah, that's right. Because technically a control station is not 100% reliable.
Nope.
And
nope, they fail.
But that is sufficient to take manual control of the aircraft. I was wondering, like, one of my thoughts was, so one of the applications that I've heard of for autonomous drones is volumetric assessment. So let's say that you were at a rock quarry, and at the end of every day there was a programmed drone mission that would go up, fly towards the gravel pile, and do a volumetric assessment to determine how much gravel was in the gravel pile.
Yeah, do your constant inventory check.
Yeah, like an inventory check or something like this. Or maybe like it was like a yard of machinery, and then they were checking to see where each bulldozer has a QR code on it, and then they check to see where each bulldozer is.
Exactly. Because it'd be cheaper to buy one drone than to buy 1,000 GPS transceivers,
That's
for
right.
example.
So, in this scenario that I've described, in Canada, if you wanted to do it with a drone that was over 250 grams, you would need to have an operator sitting at the controls.
Yeah.
Would it be sufficient if the operator had one button in front of them that said return to home?
Yeah.
Is that enough?
By definition of, as long as the system was reliable and you just had a big red button to cancel and return to home.
Is that enough manual control of the aircraft? Because they say manual control. What does manual control mean? Does manual control mean that you can pitch, roll, and yaw at any moment? Or does manual control mean that you can decide to end that operation?
What if the system was never designed to have... So I've run into this. I've trained customers that have almost exclusively operated their RPAS under full autonomy, relying on software. And to the point where I've set them up for training, and then it's like we're going there. I'm like, okay, what system are you using? Oh, well, we use this, but we've never flown it manually. We don't even know how to. And it turns out it was a major manufacturer drone that just happened to be running custom software on it. And it's like, well, all you need to do is close this app and suddenly the sticks work. I guess if we take it black and white, you need to have some sort of sticks that you can alter the flight path of the drone to avoid an aircraft if there was an aircraft in the way. So, yeah, a big red button wouldn't be sufficient, because you need to cancel the autonomy of the aircraft.
Yes. Yeah. So that's my thought. I think that's kind of that regulation. This is like we're talking about. This is the edge of that regulation.
I think that we will see a point where a big red button is sufficient with, again, demonstrated reliability. This will become like a safety assurance declaration, right?
Or if the big red button wasn't return to home, maybe if it was land.
Flight termination system.
Flight termination, yeah. Controlled flight termination, because they don't want to just fall in. Like,
no. But yeah, if you press the big red button and it uses the vision system and the vision system has a level of redundancy that allows it to land completely autonomously, then that would move that operation into the 901 section and you wouldn't need an SFOC.
What are some of the applications? So we've talked about a couple. Law enforcement and public safety is one.
Security.
Perimeter security or search and rescue, that sort of thing.
Yep. Building cleaning eventually.
Yep. Inspections for railways, pipelines, agriculture.
Lot inventory management, asset management. Let's say you're like the import yards down in Delta and Annacis Island for all the cars. Where is car XYZ? Right. I was sitting there doing drone training a while back watching they have vans that drive people around to find vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what system they use right now, but imagine if they, like you just said, put QR codes on vinyl decals on all the vehicles. They get scanned. There's just a printer that like takes a big giant tape roller and puts it on the roof of the car every time. And then they scan that QR code and then it uses vision to track where that car is in the lot.
Mm-hmm.
You could have this drone or something like this, a swarm of these things flying all day long, tracking the position of vehicles.
So Ian, the primary purpose of this drone, what is this for?
Selfies
and social media and content creation.
Yeah.
So full autonomy especially with a drone like this where it is a micro drone, so it can act autonomously and you don't necessarily need a visual observer.
Mm-hmm.
If you are a solo content creator, this is an option for you. There is some debate as to whether or not this drone has the performance to reliably fly outdoors.
Yeah, well, that's something I haven't done too much flying outdoors yet. Cole's notes, I think if you already own a Vata 2, you should have one of these in your bag.
Okay.
For the cost of what it is.
Spoken like a guy who owns an Avata 2. So let's talk about some of the benefits, some of the risks, and some of the aircraft that are available on the market. So some of the benefits, you can operate in a GPS-denied environment for law enforcement if there's some sort of GPS geofencing. Automatic route capabilities. So if you're doing a mapping mission, you can map much more accurately using a pre-programmed GPS as opposed to just manually flying some sort of mapping mission. It will be much, much more accurate, and you'll get exactly what captures you'll need for that mapping mission. Easier cinematic shots by yourself, because if you're by yourself and you're trying to get a cinematic shot of you and you're holding the controller, it's not going to look that good.
Okay, so here's one big application. I don't think this is the drone for it, and I think there's going to be a next generation that will definitely, like, 'cause remember, the first iteration of something like this is always going to be.
Would you consider this the first iteration, or would you consider the Tello the first iteration?
Oh, they're not even in the same ballpark.
Okay.
The Tello was supposed to be an introduction to STEM and robotics.
Right.
Right. It's a tool, similar price point when it first came out. I remember in the mid-teens when they came out and wanting to get one, but it was too much. It was like $200 or more. This is $200 or more, but it's way better camera. Right. The Tello was a 720p fixed camera that didn't have a gimbal. Yeah, it's a culmination of optimization, just like the Mini was an optimization culmination from the Air and the Spark and everything else. One of the big things that I think that this will help with, one of the YouTube segments that I can't enjoy right now is off-road and overland vloggers that...
Oh, they set up the drone to follow their car, and you're like, you're flying illegally?
They don't set it up to follow the car.
Oh, no.
They drive and fly the drone at the same time.
That is illegal. Do not do that.
So there's some very popular overland YouTube channels in BC that have some incredible cinematic views, very good cinematography, well produced. The majority of the shots I've seen, there's only one person in the vehicle at a time, and you'll see an RC2 bolted to the windshield, and they'll use autonomy to follow the vehicle because it does do that, but it's typically done with an over 250 gram drone like a Mavic 3 Pro or Air 3S. All you need to do to be in compliance with the cars is switch to a sub 250 gram drone.
Or have someone sitting in the passenger seat. It is explicit in the cars.
Yeah.
There is a specific one, I can't remember what number it is, but it's...
Don't operate a vehicle and a drone at the same time.
Don't operate a vehicle and a drone at the same time.
Well, and so here's the thing. We're off-road. So the Vehicle Highway Act, I don't know what you could say about that, right? The operating electronics and driving at the same time. That's not our expertise at all. But the car side is. And if you're off-road, the risks should be less. You're probably in Class G airspace. That's another thing you got to consider when you're doing this. I've seen one video where they absolutely were in Class F restricted because it was in the vicinity of a forest fire and you could actually hear helicopters in the background. So not great. But the autonomy component of it, the vehicle tracking, and Cole's notes, I tried to get this thing to track vehicles using just the app. Didn't work. I don't know about using the full controller yet. We haven't tested that. But it doesn't track vehicles with using just your phone. So there is limited tracking. And again, the whole point of me testing it was it's legal to do that. Maybe not operate the phone at the same time while you're driving. So there's another whole problem. But at least having a 135 gram drone track you is, from the Transport Canada perspective, allowed in the cars because it's a sub 250 gram drone. Using something over 250 grams to track a vehicle in any environment where the operator is also the driver is not legal. A few years ago, another case example of using autonomy wrong, Skydio has a really good, well, they were arguably pioneers in the vision tracking based system. When the Skydio 2 came out, not the X2. It's the blue and black Skydio.
The blue and black one before they pivoted to Enterprise. We'll know for sure in several moments.
Okay, and just as a comment, Mike piped up here, and he's an expert on this. Traffic Safety Act does not apply when off a highway. Even a gravel road, however, is still a highway. So any kind of FSR or gravel road but private property would be acceptable. So, yeah. And that's true because if you are off-road, you still have to have liability insurance for off-road vehicles, and you still have to have, because you're on Forest Service roads, which are technically roads. So you do have to still be insured. So the road acts would still apply. Can't operate your bike drunk, for example. So I don't know. That's the first thing I thought of.
What?
Well, you can't. It's stupid. But someone can fact check me in the comments on the name. But it was the blue and black drone that came out in the mid-teens. It had 6 cameras on board. It had omnidirectional obstacle avoidance, and it had really good subject tracking because it used an NVIDIA Tegra on board. Like, it had this massively powerful processor that had no business being on a drone, and there were downsides to that. Like, the battery life was terrible. So, because it was running basically a laptop flying around. But it had really good vehicle tracking capability. 2 or 3 years ago, I saw a video of someone flying a Skydio, well, not flying, autonomously, letting the Skydio 2 follow them through downtown Surrey on major highways, like on King George and on 104. Like, they went probably about 8 blocks, traveled downtown, and the Skydio was dodging power lines, light stands, street lights, and they're just driving, and then they come to a bank and stop, and the drone lands. And yeah, solo operator, distance from people, bystanders, and operating a vehicle while driving or flying.
And also, if they're in downtown Surrey, there is a heliport there as well.
So they're in an advanced environment as well.
They are in an advanced environment.
Guarantee that operator was not in advanced.
No, because if they were, then they would know.
They would know better.
They would know better. So some of the risks associated, we've already touched on many of these. Your technology may fail, go beyond line of sight. And of course, anything, especially with we're talking about autonomy, it is still relatively new in the drone space to have autonomy.
Yeah.
So there is the risk that something goes wrong technology-wise. As a pilot, you may become dependent on technology. You know, I've talked to some pilots who are now at the airlines, and they say every couple of years I go fly a Cessna, so I remind myself how to use the stick and the rudder. You can become reliant on technology, and then if there was an emergency and you've only been flying autonomously and you have to pick up the controller, use the sticks, are you going to accurately use the sticks, accurately fly the aircraft? Maybe, maybe not. It can lead to a lack of situational awareness, especially if you're not looking at the drone. If it's flying autonomously, you're not looking at it. If something were to happen with that drone, in this case, maybe a fire starts to smoke, or maybe it just hits someone. It could lead to a lack of situational awareness. That's why if this was a drone that was more than 250 grams and it was following you, and even let's say you're walking and it's following you, but you're not looking at the drone, that's not really within line of sight anymore. So we would recommend a visual observer probably in that case.
I think maybe it's worth mentioning as well that even though autonomy features are super cool and that, you always want to be able to not only be familiar with the manual controls, but be pretty competent. Kind of what Finn touched on is be competent with the manual controls just in the event that something happens. You don't want to be kind of flustered and frazzled.
Or just have the drone be complete, like your orientation is gone and you can't figure out which way it's going.
Yeah, just think about it in terms of airplanes. The autopilot in an airplane is not there to fly the plane for the pilots. The autopilot is there to decrease workload during normal operations. In the event of an emergency, the pilots take manual control of the aircraft.
Yeah.
100 times out of 100.
Yeah.
Sully Sullenberger did not use autopilot to land that A320 in the Hudson River.
Dial the flight director.
Yeah. This leads to just the importance of having proper emergency procedures and emergency procedures that fit the operation. So if you're using an autonomous drone operations, having some emergency procedures around a failure of autonomy or having to take manual control of the aircraft are a good step to making sure that you are having safe flight. Remember to review your emergency procedures. This is one of the things that we find. You know, you're preparing for the flight review, you write your emergency procedures. It is unlikely that you will ever look at them again until you have an emergency. That could be years. It could be years between you writing them and it happening. That's why we recommend every once in a while, just take a look at them.
Well, just make sure they're relevant.
Exactly.
Right? Beyond just the minimum car standard, are they relevant to what you're doing?
Yes.
Because the reality is these are going to be memory items. They're going to be, by the time you've opened your book, the emergency is over, right?
Or has progressed to the point where you no longer can do anything about it. So what should you do in the event of a flyaway in the case of an autonomous drone? As we've talked about, in Canada, if it is over 250 grams, there's no such thing as full autonomy. So in the event of a flyaway, it would have to be RTH.
Flight termination.
Flight termination or RTH.
Yeah.
Something like this flies away. Shout at it, wave at it, or
shrug.
Or shrug and say, well, that was a good $250. If this thing flies away, there's not a whole lot you could do unless you had the controller with you and could get it to return to home.
Yeah, and so if you're using your phone, the range is limited to about 90 meters. It's not great because it's dependent on the antennas in your phone. Mm-hmm. So
I'm not sure how to word this question, but is there a situation where you could technically argue negligence? Going back to kind of like don't obviously operate the drone safely, is there a situation where you could, in theory, argue negligence with something like this if it were to fly away?
900-06 is going to be your litmus. Like the reg is don't be an idiot. Don't pose a hazard to any person or aircraft. If you're operating this thing in the area that could cause damage to an aircraft, then yeah, you would be negligent. Yeah. And if you did a droney, for example, and the droney goes up to 100 meters, mm-hmm. and you're in the approach path, then there's a good chance it would hit a plane. At 135 grams, it's still going to probably break a windscreen.
It would definitely crack it. I don't know if it would go through, but it would definitely crack it.
Yeah, it's still not a risk that you would want to take.
No.
Like, I absolutely would not want that hitting a tail rotor, for example. It would still cause an imbalance, and the subsequent imbalance and the rotation of that could cause catastrophic failure of an aircraft.
That's right. So what aircraft are on the market that have some level of autonomy? We've got the Skydio X2, the Autel Evo Max 4T, and DJI M30T. These are aircraft that are designed for industrial purposes or mapping missions, so their autonomy is not maybe based on cinematography, but is based on planning and executing a mapping or inspection mission.
Yeah. You can set waypoints, have them navigate those waypoints, and also use vision to protect themselves.
That's right. And then for cinematography, we've got the Skydio the 2 Plus, which is what we talked about, the black and blue one. The Hover Air X1, and then the DJI Neo, which is our brand new, the most recent drone on this list and the most recent drone in our fleet, selfie drone. And you've probably seen me look at it. It's already been crashed once.
Oh, it's been crashed lots. It's pretty durable.
Check out our unboxing to see it crash.
Crash about 6 times in a row in about 2 minutes. So the other drones on the market, obviously, anything that has APAS, DJI's advanced positioning, and something of system avoidance system. So Mavic, Air, almost all. Even the Mini now. They almost do. All of them now have omnidirectional. I think they kind of feature lock it a little bit at certain tiers. So the Mavic 3 definitely has omnidirectional. The Mini 4 Pro has omnidirectional. The Air 3 I believe, is forward, backward, upwards, downwards, and maybe not side to side, or they did add it in the last reach.
Mm-hmm. So what we've got on the screen right now is an advertisement for the Hover Air, and what's nice about this one is it folds. So it folds to a little bit more compactly than the Neo here, and it is also a sub 250 micro drone. So
it
for
is.
Canadian
Okay.
regulations, yeah. So this is another option on the market, and you can and it's.
Oh, and it has a hardware button controller
Yes.
as well. So a little bit more than just vision-based tracking. It's going to use some sort of Wi-Fi and or GPS-based tracking as well.
That's right, and the camera on it is I think comparable. Yeah, so using AI to determine what something is, like using some sort of like neural network to comb through, because one of the things with one of the things that is big in survey is like the data interpretation takes a long time. There's great stories from many moons ago of the U-2 spy planes that flew over the Soviet Union, and then the operators who were doing the videos like spending hours like with a magnifying glass. Now we can use AI to do that sort of thing, and using the AI in the drone to make the survey, and then using AI after to process that image.
Yeah, so identification and classification.
Exactly. That's kind of what we have on autonomy today. So let's open it up and see if there's a question from the chat.
We've talked about object identification and classification. So autonomy also comes from using neural nets after the fact. So inventory tracking, management, positioning, location, using QR codes or using actual visual recognition. There's search and rescue software out there that does color sampling from large scale imagery. So up in the Yukon and Northwest Territories, they'll use drones for large area searches because, for example, they may get a color sample or swatch from someone's clothing, and then they'll look for that color against the tundra, right? Because if you've got 100-kilometer area and everywhere looks the same identically, it's going to be really difficult to look for evidence of a person in that area. So they'll take a sample of the color, use that, and then use AI to identify those maybe it's 1 or 2 pixels that it finds. So it gives you an idea or a way to search and narrow it down. So search and rescue, thermal, identifying hotspots using the autonomy. All this data that's being collected now is going into just massive data sets all over the world that they're building out to create that digital twin, so then they can start applying other models or other computation against it as well. So what we're seeing at like the consumer selfie drone level is just the tip of the iceberg in comparison to what the big data management and autonomy that's being done at the back end, not necessarily in the drone. So these are data capture devices at the end of the day. They always have been, but that data is what happens to it after the fact. That's also the pretty exciting stuff. So anyway, thanks for joining us this week and talking about drone autonomy. Appreciate you joining us, and hopefully if you enjoyed this, you can hit that like and subscribe button. And stay tuned for next week. We'll be back again every Wednesday live here on Coastal Community and then up on YouTube in a short time thereafter. So thanks again, and we'll see ya.
Have a good one.